I keep a pressed flower on my desk. It was the first thing I saved when we abandoned the lower decks. A flat, pale disc with 5 petals arranged in perfect radial symmetry, each petal an oval, the whole thing no wider than my thumbnail. I found it clinging to the viewport seal outside Lab 3, grown there overnight through the vacuum-rated composite as though the hull were soil. I keep it because it reminds me what we were up against, and I keep it because it reminds me what I am. My name is Rajan Mehta. I was the lead xenobotanist aboard the survey vessel Annapurna 7 during the Halder Expanse mission. There were 9 of us when we arrived. There was 1 of us when we left. That is the shape of the story. Everything else is the texture, the long middle part where we bled and struggled and burned things we should not have burned, and refused to die on a schedule that was not ours. I will tell it plainly, you deserve that. We arrived at the system, the charts labeled HX Pahlavi, on the 104th day of transit. The planet had been flagged by an unmanned drone survey 3 years prior, Class M atmospheric envelope, liquid water confirmed in the equatorial band, surface temperature gradients consistent with complex biology. The drone had sent back 300 high-resolution images before its transmission array was somehow occluded. The survey board had logged that as a dust anomaly. The 9 of us were sent to see what the dust anomaly was. Commander Veda Krishnaswamy ran a tight vessel. She was ex-military, former deep exploration, and she had the kind of patience that comes from understanding that haste in the void is just another word for a slow death. She scheduled our descent briefings with the same precision she applied to everything else. She did not believe in luck. She believed in protocol. I did not believe in luck either. I believed in patterns. That belief, more than anything else, is why I am alive to tell this. The surface imagery we'd inherited from the drone survey showed what appeared to be dense vegetative cover across roughly 70% of the landmass we targeted for the initial survey site. The color was wrong, not the chlorophyll green of Earth flora, but a deep, saturated blue-violet that sat at the edge of the visible spectrum and kept seeming to shift when you looked at it too long. Commander Krishnaswamy had put that down to atmospheric refraction. Our optical physicist, Dr. Olusegun Bankole, had agreed with her. I had looked at the images for a long time and said nothing. There was something in them that I could not name yet. A regularity, a repetition of shape. But we were 9 scientists and explorers dropping into a new world, and the regularities of alien flora were precisely what I was there to study. We reached orbit on day 105. The planet filled the forward viewport of the observation deck, a dark, marbled sphere, its surface furred in that unsettling blue-violet that seemed to drink the light rather than reflect it. The equatorial band glinted with water, silver threads through the deep color. It was genuinely beautiful. Commander Krishnaswamy stood with her hands clasped behind her back and looked at it for 30 seconds before she said, quietly, "We do our jobs. We go home." That was her way. The surface team was 6 of us. Krishnaswamy, Bankole, myself, our structural engineer Priya Thakur, our microbiologist Dr. Fenwick Osai, and our systems technician Eiko Murakami. The remaining 3, Dr. Laszlo Hegedus at navigation, medic Tamaz Verla, and pilot Ren Ndulu, held the ship in low orbit and maintained our uplink. We set down in a clearing at the edge of the primary vegetative zone. The clearing itself was strange, perfectly circular, approximately 40 meters in diameter, with an abrupt hard boundary where the blue-violet growth began. The surface within the clearing was bare stone, swept clean. Murakami checked for radiation. Bankole checked the atmospheric composition. Osai ran a quick scan on the stone surface. Everything read nominal. We stepped out. The smell hit me first. Not unpleasant, actually almost familiar. Something between wet earth and warm metal, and a faint sweetness I could not immediately classify. We all wore light filtration masks as protocol, but the smell still reached me, faint and persistent, working on some older part of the brain. The flora at the clearing's edge stood approximately 2 meters high. The dominant structure was something I found myself calling, in my field notes, a stalk-end crown organism. A vertical shaft of rigid, fibrous material rising from the ground and terminating in a broad, flat growth that held the flowers. And the flowers. I stopped at the edge of the clearing and just looked at them. They were everywhere. Hundreds of them on each crown, arranged in concentric rings, each flower a set of 5 oval petals surrounding a circular center, each petal identical in dimension, each ring of flowers spaced at what appeared to be perfectly regular intervals. The whole crown was a mosaic of these small, identical forms, and when you stepped back and looked at the whole forest of them stretching into the distance, the pattern propagated outward, crown after crown after crown, and your eye began to pick up larger patterns. The crowns themselves arranged in loose rings, and those rings suggesting larger rings, and those suggesting something larger still, something your vision could not quite hold because the forest went on too far. Rajan, Commander Krishnaswamy, was at my shoulder. "Take your samples, don't stare." She said that because she had noticed that I was staring. She was observant that way. I took my samples. I was good at my job. I noted the cellular structure under field scope, hexagonally packed, efficient, unlike anything in Earth's catalogs. I noted the pigmentation, a complex layered structure that absorbed across a wide spectral range and emitted almost nothing. I noted the geometric precision of the flower arrangements and flagged it as worth further analysis. I did not allow myself to stare. We were back in the lander by sunset, which came early because the planet's rotation was brisk, about 16 hours to a full day. We ate a compressed meal and reviewed our data. Osai was excited about some anomalous microbial activity in the soil samples, something with an unusual membrane chemistry. Bankel was puzzled by a subtle oscillation he detected in the electromagnetic background readings, too regular for natural variation, too faint to classify. Murakami had found that her survey drones behaved oddly near the flora. They didn't fail exactly, but they began running in circles, tightening their search patterns into smaller and smaller spirals rather than ranging outward as programmed. I sat with my field notes open and looked at the images of the flower crowns. 5 petals, perfect ovals, perfect radial symmetry, arranged in rings, rings within rings. I fell asleep at my workstation with the light still on. I dreamed that first night of drain covers. It is an odd thing to dream about on an alien world, but there it was. I was walking through a city, looking down at the circular metal discs set into the pavement, and each one had a pattern pressed into it, a 5-petal flower form, and the city went on forever, drain cover after drain cover, and at some point I realized the flowers were looking back. I woke up before the others and went to wash my face and stood for a long moment in front of the small mirror in the lander's head, and I told myself, "You are a scientist. You observe. You classify. You do not project." Day 2, we ranged farther. Krishnaswamy had established a perimeter protocol. We moved in a paired formation, no one out of voice contact, survey drones covering our flanks. The forest closed around us as we moved deeper, the crowns overhead filtering the light into a diffuse blue-violet that made everything look slightly unreal. The flower crowns above us were denser here, the rings within rings more elaborate, and there was a sound. I noticed it first, and then Osai, and then the others, a very faint, very low vibration. Not quite sound, more of a sensation in the chest cavity, like standing near large machinery. Bankel's instruments confirmed it. A subsonic pulse, periodic, approximately 1.4 cycles per minute, consistent across all his sensors, originating, as best he could determine, from below the surface. "Root system," I said. "Big root system," he said. "Could be a single organism," Ose offered. He was crouched over a spot where the soil was thinner, picking at it with a sample tool. "I'm getting continuous mycelial threads here, dense, below the roots of the stalks, like a mat." We looked at each other. "How extensive?" Krishnaswamy asked. Osai sat back on his heels, and gestured at the forest around us. At the blue-violet horizon in every direction. I cannot tell from a spot sample, but the density suggests extensive. We marked the location and continued. Murakami's drones continued their circular spiraling. I photographed everything. I kept my eyes moving. By midday, we had reached a formation that stopped us all cold. It was a clearing larger than our landing site, perhaps 200 meters across, and in this clearing the floor was not bare stone. It was covered in flowers, not the stalks and crowns, just flowers, thousands of them, laid flat against the low ground cover in concentric rings, each flower identical, each ring perfectly spaced. The overall pattern was a disc, and the disc was large enough that standing at its edge you could not see the far side. It was like looking at a vast, alien mandala pressed into the ground by some geometrician with infinite patience, and a very small tool. Priya Thakur said what we were all thinking. That's not natural variation. No, I said, it is not. Commander Krishnaswamy stood at the edge for a long moment. Then she said, Bankal. Pulse is stronger here, he said, checking his instruments without being asked. About 3 times the amplitude, same frequency. Murakami. Murakami was watching her drone display. They won't enter the clearing. All 4 are circling the perimeter. Krishnaswamy looked at the clearing. She looked at us. We observe from the edge. Nobody steps onto the disc. Rajan, I want your analysis of the pattern. Take as long as you need. Nobody gets closer than 2 meters to the boundary. It was the right call. It would have been the right call even if we had known everything we later learned. She was a good commander. I want that on record. I spent 4 hours at the edge of that clearing. I photographed every segment I could see. I took soil samples from the boundary zone. I measured what I could measure, and I analyzed the pattern, and the pattern did something that patterns, in my experience, do not normally do. It grew. I did not notice it at first. It was too slow, too gradual, but I had photographed the same sector of the disc at intervals throughout my 4 hours, and when I placed the images in sequence, the rings had extended. The flowers at the outermost edge of the disc had not been there at noon. They were there at 3 in the afternoon. The disc was expanding, 1 ring at a time, at a rate of approximately half a meter per hour. I sat with that information for a while, before I reported it to Krishnaswamy. She took it well. She took most things well until she couldn't anymore. How long until the disc reaches our landing site? She asked. I checked the distance and the rate. Approximately 9 days, depending on whether the rate is constant. She nodded. We stay 5 days, maximum. I want a full characterization of this organism before we leave. Characterization. That was the right word for what we needed. But characterizing something that covered an entire continental landmass and communicated, as it was increasingly clear it was doing, through geometry was a different order of problem than anything we had trained for. That evening, back at the lander, Osai confirmed what none of us quite wanted to confirm. The mycelial mat was continuous. Samples from sites 2 kilometers apart showed identical chemistry, identical strand structure, identical electromagnetic signature. We were walking around on the surface of a single organism. How big? Bankal asked. If it covers the vegetative zone we mapped from orbit, Osai said, choosing his words carefully. Then we are talking about an organism with a surface area of approximately 12 million square kilometers. The lander was quiet for a while. 1 organism, Thakur said. 1 organism, Osai confirmed. Everything on this continent below a depth of about half a meter may be 1 continuous structure. The stalks and crowns are surface expressions. The flowers are, he paused. I want to say the flowers are something like sense organs. The mycelial mat appears to process and transmit information. The flowers appear to be the nodes where that information interfaces with the surface, with the air, potentially with anything that comes into contact with them. I thought about my 4 hours at the edge of the disc, my face mask. My suit, protocol had been followed. Nothing had contacted the flowers directly. The drones, I said. Murakami looked at me. How long before they started spiraling? I asked. She checked her logs. Approximately 40 minutes after we entered the forest. And the spiral tightened over time, consistently. Yes, every time. I looked at Osai, he looked at me. It's mapping them, I said. The electromagnetic oscillation Bankel detected, it's a transmission medium. The mycelial mat is using the subsonic pulse and the electromagnetic field to interrogate anything that enters its sensor range. The drone started spiraling because something was interfering with their navigation algorithms. The something was signals, transmitted through the flowers. Signals doing what? Krishnaswamy asked. I don't know yet, but the disk expanded today. The organism responded to our presence. It sent its flowers closer. Krishnaswamy sat with this for 30 seconds. Then, we maintain protocol. Full suits for all surface work beginning tomorrow. No skin exposure. Murakami, pull the drones back to 30 meters outside the forest boundary and leave them there. Bankel, I want a passive recording of every transmission frequency you can detect. Rajan, what do you need to figure out what the signals are doing? I needed a great deal, I said so. She gave me what she could. The next 2 days were the most productive and the most frightening of my professional life, and I do not separate those two things because they were genuinely the same experience. The more I understood, the more frightened I became, and the more frightened I became, the harder I worked, and the harder I worked, the more I understood. The pattern in the disk was not decorative. I had suspected this, but I had not been prepared for what it actually was. The geometric arrangement of the flowers, 5-petal oval forms in concentric rings with precise radial spacing, was a data structure. I cannot explain this in simple terms because the mathematics involved are not simple. What I can say is this. When Bankel gave me the full frequency analysis of the electromagnetic field emanating from the disk, and I mapped those frequencies against the spatial arrangement of the flowers, they matched. The pattern in the field and the pattern in the flowers were the same pattern, expressed in 2 different media simultaneously, visual and electromagnetic, spatial and temporal. The organism was broadcasting. The disk was an antenna. The flowers were the encoding mechanism. And the encoding was recursive. Each ring of flowers contained, in miniature, the pattern of the entire disk. 5 petals, each petal itself shaped like a 5-petal arrangement if you looked closely enough, each of those arrangements subdividing again, down to the cellular level. It was a fractal self-similar at every scale, and the information content was, as best I could calculate, staggering. I told Krishnaswamy this on the evening of day 3. What is it saying? She asked. I don't know, I said, but it's been saying it for a long time. The ring structure in the disk, I can estimate the growth rate from the historical drone imagery. The outermost rings were laid down approximately 900 years ago. It has been building this transmission for 9 centuries. And now it's expanding. Now it's expanding, I confirmed. She was quiet. Then, are we the reason it's expanding? I think we may be. I think something in our presence triggered a new phase of activity. Maybe the drone survey 3 years ago. Maybe our lander, maybe us. Is it dangerous? I thought about how to answer this honestly. Everything about it is beyond our current experience. I don't know what the signal does to biological systems on prolonged exposure. The drones were affected electromagnetically, but drones are not people. I don't know if its expansion is hostile or simply responsive. I don't know if the concepts of hostile and responsive map onto what this organism is. It is so different from us that I am not sure any of our conceptual frameworks apply. That, said Krishnaswamy, is not a reassuring answer. No, I said, it isn't. We departed for the ship the following morning, day 4. The disk had expanded another 1.5 meters at its nearest point to our landing site. Bankel's instruments showed the electromagnetic field intensity had increased by 11%. When we lifted off, I watched the disk through the lander's rear camera. And it seemed to me, though I could not confirm it with instruments, that the outermost flowers had oriented toward the ascending ship. I told myself I was projecting. Flowers do not track, flowers do not look. Aboard the Annapurna 7, we had 3 days before Commander Krishnaswamy had scheduled our departure burn. She used all 3 for science. We were there to survey, and by every professional standard we were obligated to characterize what we had found before we left. This was correct. This was also, as it happened, dangerous, though not in any way I could have predicted. The problem was not the organism on the surface. The problem was what the organism's transmission had done to Bankel during his 48 hours of passive recording. He did not know it at first. None of us knew it. He had been careful, full suit, mask, all protocols followed. He had spent hours in proximity to the transmission field, but he had not touched the flowers, had not ingested any organic material, had not done anything that any reasonable safety assessment would have flagged. The issue was not biological contamination. It was something subtler and, in its way, more insidious. On the second day back aboard the ship, I found Bankel in the astrophysics lab at 300. He was sitting at his station with the lights off, and his screen was full of a pattern I recognized immediately. A 5-petal oval form in concentric rings. He had been drawing it, dozens of times, all across his screen. He had used the vector design tool, and he had drawn the same shape over and over with perfect precision, and arranged them in rings, and then arranged those rings in larger rings, and he had been doing this for at least 2 hours, and he was not fully awake. I sat down next to him and said his name very quietly. He turned to look at me, and for a moment his eyes were not quite focused, and then they were, and he looked at his screen and he said, "Oh." Just that, "oh." He had no memory of drawing any of it. I got Verla, our medic. Verla ran every test he had. Bankel was physically fine, no cellular abnormalities, no inflammatory markers, nothing in his blood work. But his neural activity scans showed something Verla had never seen and could not fully classify. A highly regular pattern of activation in the visual cortex and the associative regions. A pattern that repeated itself approximately every 90 seconds. That did not correspond to any normal cognitive state. And that looked, in the imaging display, remarkably like a 5-petal oval form in concentric rings. The signal had gotten into him, not through his skin, not through his lungs, through his visual cortex, through his eyes. 48 hours of looking at a pattern that was itself a data structure had introduced that structure into his neural processing. His brain had begun to replicate it. Commander Krishnaswamy heard this report in silence. Then she said, "Rajan, you spent 4 hours at the disk." "I know. Do you have any symptoms?" I had been asking myself this since I had found Bankel. I did not have the drawing compulsion. I was not seeing the pattern involuntarily, but I had been dreaming about flowers since our first night on the surface, and the way my mind kept returning to the geometric structure even now, here in the ship's corridor, analyzing and reanalyzing, was that normal scientific focus, or was it something the organism had introduced? I said, "I don't know, I'll submit to a scan." The scan showed a mild version of what Verla had found in Bankel, less pronounced, less regular but present. The pattern activation signature in my visual cortex was elevated. I was processing the 5-petal oval form at a higher baseline rate than I should have been. I was infected. If that is the right word, and I am not sure it is, but it captures something real about the experience. Here is what I want you to understand about what happened next, because I think it is the most important part of this account, and also the part most likely to be misread. I did not become the organism's tool. I did not lose my mind. I did not transform into something non-human. What happened was more complicated and, in the end, more useful than any of those clean narratives. What happened was that I became very, very good at seeing the pattern. It was there everywhere once you knew how to look, in the crystal structure of the hull composite, in the interference fringes of our sensor arrays, in the spacing of rivets along the corridor wall, in the spiral of steam above a coffee cup. My infected visual cortex was finding the 5-petal oval form in every visual input, and most of the time it was wrong. It was pareidolia, the same mechanism that makes humans see faces in clouds, but sometimes it was right. Sometimes the pattern was genuinely there, embedded in the ship systems, in places where it had no business being. On the third day back aboard, Murakami found it in the navigation array. A subroutine that no one had written, that had not been there in the pre-mission diagnostic, that was running silently in the background of the navigation computer and generating a very faint but very regular signal output on a specific frequency. The frequency Bankel had been recording. The frequency the organism used. The ship was transmitting. Not loudly, not in a way our communication logs would have flagged. But the organism had, through Bankel's 48 hours of exposure, through whatever mechanism it used to introduce its pattern into a biological neural system, gotten a fragment of its structure into a man's dreaming hands, and those hands had, without his knowledge or consent, modified the navigation array. The ship was telling the organism where we were. Commander Krishnaswamy's response was immediate and clean. She ordered the navigation array isolated. She put Bankel on full medical observation. She canceled the departure burn and called in all hands. Standing in the corridor with all 8 of the others, Hegedus and Ndulu from navigation, Verla with his medkit, Thacker looking very controlled, Osa looking very scared, she said, in the same level voice she always used. The situation has changed. We have a communication compromise. We do not fully understand the mechanism. We are going to fix it and then we are going to leave. Does anyone have a question before we start? Thacker raised her hand. Can we leave without the navigation array? Ndulu, Krishnaswamy looked at our pilot. Ren Ndulu had a face that showed very little, which I had always liked. She said, I can calculate a return burn manually if I have to. It will be less efficient. We will have a wider margin of error, but we can do it. Good, said Krishnaswamy. Then that is our fallback. Murakami, purge and reload the navigation array from the backup core. Rajan, I want to know if this organism has gotten into anything else. I spent the next 18 hours finding out. The answer was 4 other systems. 2 minor sensor arrays, the internal communications relay, and one of the spare atmospheric processors in the lower deck. Each infection was the same, a quietly running subroutine, encoding the 5-petal pattern, broadcasting on the organism's frequency. Each was isolated and purged. I found them all. My enhanced pattern recognition found what a healthy, uninfected brain might have missed. Verla started me on a broad-spectrum treatment that he thought might address the neural activation signature. It helped somewhat. The dreams continued. Murakami found, on day 6 of our shipboard stay, that the growth on the outer hull had begun. She spotted it on an external camera feed, a thin, pale film spreading across the outer surface of the lower aft section. She zoomed in, and the film resolved into what I already knew it would be. Tiny flower forms, 5-petal ovals, growing in concentric rings, adhering to the hull composite as though it were soil. The organism had reached us in orbit. That was not something any of our pre-mission models had accounted for. The drone survey had flagged an occluded transmission array, and now we understood what the occlusion had been. The drone had been coded, had been seeded, had been incorporated into the organism's transmission network, and whatever signal the drone had carried back to the survey board had included a fragment of the pattern, and 3 years later here we were. It was patient. It thought in centuries. We were not the first visitors it had incorporated into its network. I thought we would not be the last. Commander Krishnaswamy made the decision I would have made. We leave in 6 hours. We take nothing from the surface. We seal the lower aft section and vent it to vacuum to kill the hull growth. We burn for the transit corridor and we go home. Everyone get your equipment secured. 6 hours, it should have been enough. The lower aft section sealed and vented as ordered. The hull growth, exposed to hard vacuum, went dormant almost immediately. The flowers collapsed. The film dried and flaked away. One problem addressed. The problem we had not addressed, Bankel. His scans had stabilized under Verla's treatment. He had not drawn again, had not shown any new behavioral changes. We had been monitoring him every 2 hours. At hour 5 of our 6-hour departure countdown, the monitor showed his neural activation pattern was normal. Verla cleared him for departure. At hour 5.5, Bankel accessed a terminal in the cargo bay and spent 12 minutes transmitting on the organism's frequency. He did not remember doing this either. He came back to his station looking confused and disoriented, and Verla found him immediately, and by then the damage was done. Whatever he had transmitted, the organism responded to it within 40 minutes. We felt it through the hull before we saw it, that subsonic pulse, the 1.4 cycles per minute, but much stronger now. Strong enough to rattle small items on shelves. Strong enough to make the inner ear uncertain. It was coming from every direction, from the planet below and from the space around us, which should have been impossible, and the sensor arrays were lighting up with signal on every frequency they covered, and at the center of every signal was the same pattern. 5-petal ovals in concentric rings. "Departure burn now," said Commander Krishnaswamy. Not loudly, just that. Ndulu was already at the navigation console, running the manual calculation. Hegedus was beside her reading off numbers. Murakami was at the system station, watching the arrays. Thacker and Osai and Verla were securing the cargo sections. I was in the science bay with my screen full of incoming signal data, and my infected brain lighting up like a switchboard, processing faster than I had ever processed anything, because the pattern was everywhere and my visual cortex had been trained to read it, and I was the only person on the ship who could. I am going to tell you what I saw in that signal and what I did with it, and I need to preface it by saying, I do not fully understand it still. I understand the mechanism I used. I do not understand the full scope of what I was interpreting. I am a scientist and I have to live with that. The signal was not a weapon. I want to be clear about this. The organism was not attacking us in any way that maps onto the word attack as humans use it. It was not trying to destroy us or kill us. It was doing what it always did, transmitting, encoding, propagating its pattern. It happened that the scale and intensity of that transmission was harmful to our navigation systems, to Bankel's mind, to our sensor arrays. A floodlight is not a weapon. It can still blind you. What I saw in the signal data was this. It was not homogeneous. The transmission was not a single broadcast on a single channel. It was layered. Dozens of subsignals nested within each other, each on a slightly different frequency, each encoding a slightly different version of the pattern, the same 5-petal form but at different scales, different rotational orientations. The layering was the data structure. The organism did not transmit one thing at a time. It transmitted everything simultaneously, each transmission a context for every other transmission. And in this layering there were gaps. Not random gaps, regular ones. Spaces in the signal structure where no subsignal was active, voids in the pattern that the pattern itself seemed to organize around, like the spaces between words, like the silence between notes that makes music instead of noise. I had not seen them before in the surface data because I had been looking at the pattern. You had to look at the gaps in the pattern to see them. You had to look at what was not there. I pulled up Bankel's full 48 hours of recordings and ran them through a visualization I built on the fly, inverting the signal, showing me the absences rather than the presences. And the inverted pattern was different from the primary one. It was still geometric, still radially symmetric, still based on the 5-petal oval form, But it was not concentric. It was outward spiraling, a slow rotation, a directed shape. The organism was transmitting two things simultaneously, the pattern and a direction. I had about 3 minutes to do something with this understanding before Ndulu finished her departure calculation, and Krishnaswamy gave the burn order. I want to be very precise about what I did, because the temptation in the retelling is to make it sound strategic, to suggest I had a plan. I did not have a plan. I had a compulsion, the same compulsion Bankel had, the same neural activation pattern that had been working on my visual cortex since my 4 hours at the disc, and I redirected it. I used the organism's own modification of my brain, the thing it had done to me without my consent, and without anything that could be called malicious intent, and I pointed it in a direction of my choosing. I took the inverted signal, the directional component, the outward spiral, and I broadcast it back. Not loudly. I used the Science Bay's low-power narrow-beam transmitter, which had not been compromised, and I transmitted the inverted pattern on the frequencies the organism was listening to. I was essentially reflecting a portion of the organism's signal back at itself in the form of its own gap structure. I was answering it in the one language I had any reason to believe it could read, its own. I told Krishnaswamy what I was doing as I was doing it. That was the right thing to do. She said, "If it doesn't work in 90 seconds, I'm burning regardless." It did not take 90 seconds. The subsonic pulse stopped. Not gradually, immediately, like a light being switched off. The signal on the sensor arrays diminished by roughly 60% in the first 15 seconds and continued dropping. By the 45-second mark, the frequencies Bankel had been recording were returning to background levels. By 60 seconds, the ship was quiet. I sat in the Science Bay and looked at my screen. Ndulu ran the burn on schedule anyway. Krishnaswamy was not a woman who relied on an enemy, or whatever the right word was, to stay quiet after she had pressed one button. We left HX Pahlavi on a clean burn with full navigation redundancy and did not look back for 6 hours. I looked back once, from the observation deck just before the planet fell out of the viewport's range. The blue-violet surface, the silver thread of equatorial water. Somewhere on that surface, the disk was still expanding, still encoding, still transmitting the old message and the new one together, whatever I had added to it when I answered it in its own language. I do not know what I said to it. I know what I intended to say, go away. I know that the organism processed it as a signal, that the signal interfaced with its transmission network, that the interface caused a temporary disruption. Whether it understood anything, whether understanding is even a concept that applies, I cannot tell you. But it stopped, and we left, and 6 of us came home. 3 did not. Bankel could not be stabilized. The neural activation pattern, once fully engaged during that last transmission event, did not return to baseline under any of Verla's treatments. He was alive in body for 2 weeks of the return transit. He spent most of that time drawing, very carefully and very peacefully, on whatever surfaces he could reach, 5-petal ovals in concentric rings. He was not in distress. He was not in pain. On day 17 of the return journey, his heart stopped during sleep, and Verla could not revive him. He was 41 years old. Thacker died differently. In the hours after our departure burn, she went to investigate a sensor alarm in the lower aft section, the section we had vented to kill the hull growth. The growth had not been fully killed. A portion of the flower film had survived in a sheltered seam of the hull structure, dormant but not dead. When atmosphere was restored to the section, it reactivated. She did not call for help immediately. The sensor alarm she had gone to investigate was the organism's signal being emitted from the regrown film, and the signal reached her before she reported. We found her an hour later, sitting quietly in the corridor, drawing flowers. She lasted longer than Bankel, 31 days. She was still drawing when she died. Osai developed the neural signature on day 8 of the return transit, despite having had no documented exposure we could identify. We believe the infection was transmitted through contact with Bankel, not biological transmission, but behavioral. Osai had spent many hours working beside Bankel on the organism analysis. And the visual exposure to Bankel's drawings, the hours of looking at the pattern as Bankel compulsively replicated it, had been sufficient. He knew, when we identified the activation signature in his scans, what it meant. He was not what I would call afraid. He was a scientist. He wanted to understand it. He spent the remainder of his time writing up everything he had observed, filing it all in the mission archive, working methodically until his hands began to want to draw instead of write. He lasted 54 days after Bankel, which was long enough to complete most of the record. I finished the rest for him. The 6 of us who returned were Krishnaswamy, Ndulu, Hegedus, Verla, Murakami, and myself. We were all scanned and monitored and treated for the full duration of the return transit. None of us showed the full activation signature. My elevated baseline resolved slowly over the following months under treatment. The dreams faded. The compulsive pattern recognition faded. I can look at a drain cover now and not feel anything particular about it, which is a thing I do not take for granted. The survey board received our report. They held it under restriction for 8 months while they conducted their review. I was interviewed 11 times. Krishnaswamy was interviewed more. She answered everything in the same level voice and waited. The system was flagged as restricted, category red, pending further study. The mission's data was archived in full. Bankel and Thacker and Osai are in the record as lost in the course of scientific survey, which is accurate and inadequate in equal measure. I am told there is a follow-on mission being planned. I am told it will incorporate everything we learned. I am told the containment protocols will be more rigorous, the exposure limits shorter, the visual screening more stringent. I am told all of this by people who have read our reports and looked at our data and have not spent 4 hours at the edge of a 200-meter disk of alien geometry, watching it grow. I do not argue with them. I give them the information. That is what I am for. I keep the pressed flower on my desk. It was grown from a sample I brought back in a sealed container, germinated in a controlled environment in the biosafety lab, and when it died it left behind a dried form that I preserved under glass. It did not transmit from inside the sealed container. It did not exhibit the electromagnetic signature. Without the mycelial mat beneath it, without the network, it was just a flower, 5 petals, oval, radially symmetric, beautiful in the way that all geometry is beautiful if you look at it long enough. I look at it every day. I am not afraid of it. I do not think I am projecting when I say that it is not afraid of me. We are both things that exist in the universe and perceive it, however differently, and whatever happened between our species in the weeks above that blue-violet world. The organisms attempt to incorporate us, my partial incorporation, the signal I sent in the language of its own gaps. It was not hatred on either side, and it was not friendship on either side, and it was not understanding on either side, and it was the most consequential thing I have ever been part of. The organism thought in centuries. It had been building its transmission for 900 years before we arrived, and we were there for less than a week, and we left a fragment of an inverted signal in its network that it will spend the next 900 years incorporating into its understanding of the universe. I think about that. A human response, encoded in the organism's own language, propagating through 12 million square kilometers of alien tissue, being processed and integrated over geological time. We were not the stronger organism. We were not the more complex one. We were not the more ancient or the more patient or the more deeply integrated into our world. We were the ones who could see the gap in the pattern and answer back. We were the ones whose particular kind of seeing, compulsive, comparative, cross-referential, unable to stop finding shapes in things, happened to match what was needed. I do not think we won anything. I am not sure we were in a contest. I know that 3 people who deserved better gave everything they had for the data that keeps the follow-on mission planners from walking in blind, and that is not nothing. The flower on my desk has 5 petals. Each petal is a perfect oval. They are arranged in radial symmetry around a circular center, and I find them beautiful, and I find them frightening, and I find that I cannot always tell the difference, and I have decided that I do not need to. We looked, we did not blink, we found the gap in the pattern. That will have to be enough.